Hi, welcome back. Thanks for watching. So this is a request actually that I got. Someone left a comment on the channel asking if I could take a look at a 15 marker on mystical experiences and numinous experiences. And I haven't written the essay, but I've put together a few bits and pieces that might help with planning. So I was really intrigued by this question. So let's have a look at it. It's a 15 mark answer, which is AO2. So here it is. Nice picture of William James there, because you're going to want to probably include him somewhere in your answer. Mystical experiences are easier for religious believers to understand than numinous experiences. So because this is an AO2, it's not asking you to write down everything you know about mystical experiences and everything you know about numinous experiences. We're talking about what's easier to understand for believers, possibly for people who have them. So all I'm going to do is try and help you put together a bit of a plan for how you would go about this. So with a 15 marker, I think it's always good to ask yourself these questions, and this would work for any 15 marker, not just this one. Start at the end, think about what's going to be your conclusion, and then really importantly, why is that your conclusion? It's very hard to access the top levels of the mark scheme if your conclusion isn't well justified. The examiner doesn't really care what your conclusion is, but they care how you've got there. They want to see you reasoning. They're not looking for a particular right or wrong answer, because with questions like this, there aren't going to be right and wrong answers, but there are good and bad answers. And that's important to be aware of, because a bad answer is one that isn't well supported. So that's the first thing to think about. What's your conclusion going to be? Why? How am I going to get there? What are the key words in the question? So I've picked out here the phrase easier to understand. So we're not talking about whether numinous or mystical experiences are easier to prove true. We're talking about, are they easier to understand for the person who has them? So I don't think this is really an essay about verifying whether these experiences actually happen. We're not really having that argument. We're sort of assuming that they do for the purpose of this question. We're thinking, are they easier to understand than each other? So I'll unpack that for you a little bit as we go through. Very important in any 15 marker, which arguments are strong, which arguments are weak? What do you agree with? What don't you agree with? And why? Which arguments are easiest to challenge? Which arguments make you think, actually, that's a really good point? That's critical analysis, that's evaluation, and that's what they're really looking for here. And then also, super crucial, what knowledge am I going to use and what knowledge am I going to leave out? Because remember, the marks aren't really for your knowledge, they're for what you do with that knowledge. So, like I said at the top, this isn't about writing down everything you know. In fact, it's definitely not about that. It's about selecting useful bits of knowledge that will help you make your points, but the points in the argument are the most important thing. All right, so here's a very, very quick, just a couple of lists of things to do with mystical experiences, things to do with numinous experiences. Now, I don't think you would write all of these in the essay, because that would make it AO1 rather than AO2. But by planning it in a little comparison like this, you can start to pull out some of the differences, and that might help you put your argument together. So if we take the first point on each side, for example, mystical experiences, according to James and also Walter Stace, you've got this idea of unity with the divine. A mystical experience is when you feel one with the divine. Whereas with a numinous experience, Otto's talking about a sense of the holy other. So that's talking more about a separateness. Now, it's not clear just from those descriptions which one is easier to understand. I think it will depend, but that's the sort of thing that you can get into in the essay. You can have that debate a little bit. different levels of consciousness for mystical experiences. It's deeply individual. There's a nice little quote from William James. He says, God meets the individual on the basis of his personal concerns, which might explain why these experiences all tend to be very, very different. For Otto, we've got this idea of sui generis, feelings of their own kind. So it's like our brain's got a special faculty, like a special ability to know when we're in the presence of the divine. That might be something that you say, well, actually, that makes numinous experiences more easy to understand because our brains are kind of primed to receive them, if Otto's right about that. And then you've got ineffability for mystical experiences. You've got mysterium tremendum et fascinans for numinous experiences. That in itself is, I guess, a way of putting it into words, whereas ineffability is kind of saying, well, I can't put this into words. So, like I say, not all of this knowledge is going to go in, but the better your knowledge is, the easier it will be to cut through what you need and put an argument together. So here's how I'd go about planning it. I think about arguments in favour, arguments against. So I've got 3 here. Now you might not want to put all of these in your essay. You might find that you don't have time. There's nothing to say that you have to have a certain number of points on each side. It will totally vary. And there's no set number. 3 to me feels like a good number to plan with, but if you started doing the essay and you found that you didn't have time to include all of it, that's fine, it's not a problem. So in favour of the statement, you could say mystical experiences may feel more personal. You can talk about noetic quality a little bit, in the sense that you come away from the experience knowing something new. So you could say that it is more understandable. It's union with the divine. So if you're someone who already believes in God and you have a mystical experience, you're going to understand it in that context. It's going to be, yeah, this is the God I believe in. This is the God that loves me. This is a God I have a relationship with. My example for that is Teresa of Avila, but there's lots more that you could use. And I've kind of flipped it a little bit and talked about how the numinous might be difficult to understand by saying, well, if it's the holy other, and you've got this kind of sense of uncertainty, and if C.S. Lewis uses the word dread, that might be confusing and unsettling, and actually you're having an experience that you don't understand. So on the other side, arguments against the statement, so this would be taking the view that numinous experiences are easier to understand than mystical experiences. You could say that because mystical experiences are described as non-sensuous, so you can't explain them in terms of sense experiences, and ineffable, which means you can't describe them at all, numinous experiences are therefore easier to understand because they aren't like that. You can put them into words, you can find some language to say what's happened to you. If Otto's right about the whole sui generis thing, the idea that our minds have a special ability to recognise this feeling of the holy other, then that means that we can be receptive to them, making it easier to understand the experience. And then I've used a bit of Stace on my last point. If Stace is right that mystical experiences are non-intellectual, surely that means we can't understand them at all, because they're not going anywhere near our kind of intellectual faculties. Whereas numinous experiences include at least the sense that you're in the presence of the holy other. And if you haven't read it, in the AQA textbook, page 93, I think, C.S. Lewis does a really good description of a sense of the numinous. It's from The Problem of Pain, and he puts it into words really well, which is not very easy to do. So that might be worth checking out if you want to help yourself make that point. All right, now this is the bit that I can't really help you with, because I can't do your conclusion for you. You've got to get there yourself. And the points that I've raised on the previous 2 slides, arguments for and against, it wouldn't be a good essay if you just wrote down those arguments. You've got to kind of pitch them against each other and say, well, you know, this is a strong point, this is a weak point. I'm inclined to agree with this because of X, Y, Z. I don't agree with this because I've spotted this weakness. That's what they want. But ultimately, where you're going is a conclusion. On the one hand, you could conclude the statement's true. Union with the divine gives new knowledge, therefore mystical experiences are easier to understand. On the other hand, you can go the other way and say numinous experiences provoke unique feelings, our minds recognise them, we can start to put them into words, therefore that's much easier to understand than something completely mystical. The third one might feel like a bit of a cop-out, but I don't think it is. If you argue it well enough, I think it's absolutely fair enough to say it's not possible to draw a direct conclusion about which one's easier to understand, because it totally depends on the experience. Every experience is unique. Sometimes people come away from any kind of religious experience feeling that they have understood it deeply. Sometimes people come away very confused, very unsettled, almost very worried by their experience. Some people have a completely different sense altogether. It completely depends on the experient, so the person having the experience, and what kind of experience they have. I think if you do it well enough, it's fine to have that as your conclusion, because it's a difficult one. And when we're talking about something as I guess nebulous, as kind of wishy-washy, that sounds a bit disparaging, but I don't mean it to be. When we're talking about something like religious experience, which is so hard to pin down, that's a better way of putting it. I think a conclusion like that third one there is kind of fair enough. So I hope that's been helpful. Just some final tips on how to actually write the essay. And again, this is not just for this 15 marker, it's for any of them. I wouldn't bother with an introduction. It's probably not going to give you anything useful. And if you're not careful, you can just end up writing the title again in more words. So skip an introduction and go straight into the argument. In terms of how long you'd have in the exam, you'd have 27 minutes, more or less. So try and bear that in mind when you're writing these in practice. At first, you might want to give yourself a little bit longer, but as you go through, you want to try and get it down to a tight 27, because that's how long you'd have in the exam. Third one, really important, don't over-explain, because there aren't marks for your explanations, there's marks for your arguments. You don't have to say loads and loads about what the numinous is. You don't have to go through James's 4 characteristics. You don't have to explain introvertive and extrovertive for Stace. That's not what the essay is about. So be careful, use that knowledge, but don't just parrot it back, because you won't get any marks for it. Related to that, keep the focus on the argument. Remember what I said earlier about finding the key words. So the key word, the key phrase I think in this question is easier to understand. So make sure that you're actually writing about that, which one's easier to understand and why. And finally, make sure that you've got a clear, justified conclusion. Give yourself a good few minutes to write that. It can't just be a quick sentence on the end. That's no good. It needs to have reasons in it, justifications, and try not to make it just a summary paragraph of what you've already written. Try to have your strongest point at the end in the conclusion to make it clear which side you're coming down on. Okay, really hope that's helped. I'll do more of these if you want them. Just give me a shout in the comments if there's anything you'd particularly like to see, and I'll see you next time.